Hello. So, we are moving on here. Last week we finished up our chapter on the Great Depression. Just a real quick review and recap of everything we had talked about last chapter. We talked about the stock market crash of October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. We talked about how the stock market crash occurred, how the stock market works. We discussed all of the things that had led to the stock market crash of 1829. We talked last chapter about how it was a lot of the policies of the Roaring Twenties that had come back to haunt us and had ultimately created the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties, but in the end weakened the United States in the long term, and that's what caused us to have that stock market crash. We talked about how the American people reacted to the stock market crash and how those series of events ultimately led us into the Great Depression last chapter. We also talked last chapter about how there were forces at will that were beyond the American people's control, and it was like a perfect storm. Not only was the economy faltering, people losing their life savings, people losing their jobs, people losing their homes, but we also talked about acts of nature and how the Dust Bowl and the situation out in the Midwest with Oklahoma farmers, with droughts and plagues of locusts and numerous different events taking place that only happened once in several decades, ultimately culminated all at the same time to create this national pandemic, and how because of the policies of the Roaring Twenties, the Great Depression was spread overseas and became an international crisis that the United States simply couldn't bail themselves out of very easily. We talked also last chapter about how the American people blamed Herbert Hoover for their troubles. And while the president isn't necessarily responsible for something that takes place like a Great Depression, he ultimately gets the blame for it. And at the end of the day, a president who is blamed for the troubles of the American people doesn't have enough popularity to really get anything done. And at the end of the day, that's really what we're taking a look at this through this situation when we talk about the Great Depression, as well as things that are going on in America right now. When you take a look at it, the only real power that a president of the United States has is the power of persuasion. A popular president can use that popularity to get things done. The United States Constitution is created specifically so that one person can't rule supreme. Anytime you hear somebody say, well, the President of the United States can do anything he wants, that's not true. The President has to be able to work with Congress. Those 430 some members of the House of Representatives and the 100 senators in Congress, they are the ones who ultimately make those decisions. An effective president can use his popularity to sway Congress. An ineffective, unpopular president usually doesn't get much accomplished. Yes, a president can pass an executive order here and there, and they can do a number of things that at the moment can make changes and make things move. But ultimately, if a president wants to get something specifically done, he has to work with Congress. And the reason I bring this up is because when you take a look at the Great Depression and when things started off, you see a stark contrast between Herbert Hoover, the President of the United States, who was initially holding the office when the Great Depression begins, is unpopular. The American people blame him for their troubles. He finds gridlock in Congress, doesn't get much accomplished, and the few goals he does try to accomplish may not have been a terrible idea, but because of the perception he has, he doesn't get anywhere. So in the election of 1932, the American people had a decision to make. They could either continue with the failed policies of Herbert Hoover and the gridlock of Congress, or they could move in a new direction with the Democratic candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And keep in mind at this point in time, when Roosevelt runs for president, every president except for two since the Civil War has all been Republicans. The only Woodrow Wilson had served as president as a Democratic president during World War I, and that was even somewhat of a farce that he barely won. So heading into the presidential election of 1932, you have to keep in mind the Republican Party was very powerful, and it did not look like the American people hadn't had a president from the Democratic Party in a long time. But you're dealing with a situation that was so epically difficult during the Depression, and you have two candidates that were so diametrically different from each other. Herbert Hoover wanted to help businesses, give government money back to businesses so businesses could create jobs for people and help them. That's not a bad thing, all right? But what FDR proposed was giving money and giving aid directly to the American people, which endears him to the American people right away during the Depression. And so what we see happen as a result of this is a new way of looking at the government that emerges. You know, my grandfather, to his dying day, was a Democrat. Grandpa would vote for anybody if he was a Democrat. It didn't matter if your policy, your platform for running for president was you were going to knock old people out of their wheelchairs and kick puppies. Grandpa would vote for you if you were a Democrat. And if you asked my grandfather, why are you such a diehard Democrat? Granddad would tell you, because when he was a kid growing up during the Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a Democrat, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt saved this country. And my grandfather would tell you that the FDR and his New Deal programs saved America from the Great Depression. Now, here's the truth of the matter. And unfortunately, while Granddad's been dead for a few years now, the fact of the matter is he was wrong on this matter. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal did not save the United States from the Depression. The New Deal did not end the Depression. Spoiler alert, at the end of the day, when we talk about this as historians, what ultimately ended the Great Depression was ultimately World War II, not Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs. The New Deal would show time periods where it would improve the American way of life and help Americans get through the Depression, but it didn't end the Great Depression. The economy always ultimately faltered, and it was ultimately the production that was required to win a world war that got the American economy rolling again and ultimately won the war as well as ended the Great Depression. But what my grandfather was correct about is that FDR did save America during the Great Depression, just not the way Granddad thought he did. The New Deal wasn't this grand new way of looking at the American economy and saving the United States, but what he did do was he kept the American people together during the Great Depression. At a period where the United States was getting ready to fall apart. It looked like this grand experiment in democracy was going to fail during the Great Depression. It was the biggest threat we'd seen other than the Civil War, and Franklin Roosevelt used his charisma, used his office as president to save the United States and keep the country going through its darkest hour. So what we want to look at this chapter is, how did he do it? In the first part we want to look at in this lecture is not necessarily the policy behind the New Deal, but the philosophy behind it. When you take a look at somebody like Franklin Roosevelt, he's a very popular figure in American history that many Americans, even if they're not familiar with the ins and outs of the New Deal and how exactly he did this, most of them know who he is. Roosevelt comes from a prominent American family. We already talked earlier this year about his distant cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, and how when we talk about Teddy Roosevelt, we said to keep in mind the Roosevelt family isn't one of these rags to riches stories like Carnegie and John Rockefeller or even Henry Ford. When we talk about the Roosevelts, they were a prominent family in American history. Teddy Roosevelt had already served as president, and Franklin Roosevelt had served multiple terms in Congress before he became president of the United States. The American people were familiar with the Roosevelts. However, a tragedy had struck Franklin Roosevelt before he became president. He was the vice presidential candidate for the presidency in 1920. Remember back when we talked about the presidency of Warren Harding and the return to normalcy a couple of chapters ago and how they created that great roaring 20s mentality. Franklin Roosevelt was on the ticket in that election when they lost to Warren Harding. However, shortly after the election was over, Franklin Roosevelt fell ill and he was diagnosed with polio. And, it's somewhat interesting to be discussing it today with the pandemic going on around the United States. But if any of you talk to anybody that's familiar with the polio situation back then, if you contracted polio, many people did not survive polio, and if they did, they were usually handicapped for the rest of their lives. And so what happened to Franklin Roosevelt is this wealthy, prominent American who had served multiple terms in Congress was struck with polio and would serve the rest of his life in a wheelchair. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. Later, when Franklin Roosevelt becomes president of the United States in 1932, he serves his entire presidency from a wheelchair, and the American people did not know it. You think about how incredible that is today, how the American people, how a president could keep a secret like that from the American people. But you have to understand it was a different time that we lived in back then. The average American didn't see their president. They didn't even see the president in newsreels whenever they went to the movies and stuff. They just simply heard the president over the radio. To be able to see the president of the United States was a very odd and very unique thing back in those days. So anytime the American people did see Franklin Roosevelt, he was either riding by in a parade or they saw a newsreel of him standing behind a podium or something like that. The American people knew he had polio. They knew that he walked with a cane. They knew that he was handicapped. And it was actually a source of symbolism for the American people. They saw Franklin Roosevelt as a symbol of strength, somebody who had been through something very difficult and survived and come out the other side to become president of the United States. And it gave them hope that they would come out the other side of the Great Depression also, much like he had. But the fact of the matter is, all of it was a show. Franklin Roosevelt had aides that knew his situation. They put very heavy braces on his legs that would lock them out like boards. And his sons trained to make sure that they were very strong young men. And whenever it appeared as though Franklin Roosevelt was walking in public, what was really happening was the braces were holding his legs out straight while his sons were very dramatically kind of dragging him through a crowd. And so the very few times Americans would see the president, he'd have a cane in one hand, he'd be walking with his sons arm in arm, and they'd be chatting and they'd be laughing and they'd be waving at the crowd, but it was all show business and they were making the American people feel as though the president had overcome this. And what the average American didn't know is that Franklin Roosevelt, the only president in American history to serve more than 2 terms in office, in all, Franklin Roosevelt served 3 full terms as president of the United States and was elected to a record 4th term. He served 13 years as president of the United States, did the entire thing from a wheelchair, and the average American never knew this. He was and one of the great ironies of the Great Depression is that the symbol of hope, the symbol of strength and resilience for the American people was a man in the wheelchair, and they didn't even know it.